The day my parents abandoned me felt like the end of the world. I was 10, standing on my Aunt Meredith's worn front porch, clutching a battered suitcase. My mother's perfume lingered faintly in the air, a reminder that she had been there just moments before, but only long enough to say, "You'll be better off here." Then they were gone. The engine of our old station wagon roared down the gravel driveway, leaving behind a choking cloud of dust. I watched through blurry eyes as the car disappeared over the hill, taking my twin brother Aiden and the only life I'd ever known with it. He hadn't even looked back. Aunt Meredith, sturdy and kind-eyed, gently placed a hand on my shoulder. "Come inside, Elliot. You're home now." But it didn't feel like home. Home was where Aiden was, where I'd lived in his perfect golden shadow. Aiden was brilliant, straight A's, charming, athletic. Everyone loved him. Me? I was there, a forgotten afterthought, trailing behind him like a ghost. Weeks passed in a haze of quiet dinners, unfamiliar smells, and whispered reassurances from Aunt Meredith. She worked long hours at the hospital, leaving me with dusty bookshelves and creaking floorboards for company. I buried myself in stories, letting fictional worlds drown out the aching loneliness. But school was inescapable. News of my abandonment spread fast in our small town, and I became that kid, the one left behind. Kids could be cruel, and my quiet, withdrawn nature made me an easy target. "Did your parents realize they only needed one twin?" Someone sneered once, setting off a chorus of laughter. I didn't cry. I just clenched my fists and walked away. One evening, months after I'd been left behind, Aunt Meredith brought home an old typewriter she'd found at a thrift store. "Thought you might like this," she said, her smile soft but hopeful. "You've got stories in you, Elliot." I spent that night hunched over the typewriter, hammering out tales of adventure, revenge, and redemption. In those stories, forgotten boys rose to greatness, while cruel kings paid for their sins. Writing became my armor, a place where I mattered. Years passed, marked by hardship and resilience. I earned a scholarship to a creative writing program at a prestigious university, a future I built with stubborn determination. Aunt Meredith cried when I got the acceptance letter, holding me as though she'd never let go. College was a fresh start. No one knew my past, and I could be whoever I wanted. I poured my soul into my writing, winning competitions and earning my professors' respect. I was no longer the forgotten twin. I was Elliot Morgan, a rising literary star. But fate, it seemed, wasn't done with me. One frosty December afternoon, as I reviewed final edits for a national short story contest, an email notification blinked on my laptop. The subject line sent a jolt through my chest. "It's urgent. Please call." The sender's name hit me like a punch to the gut. Melissa Morgan. My mother. For several minutes I just stared. I hadn't heard from her in over 12 years. Not a single call, letter, or awkward holiday card. And now, out of nowhere, she wanted me to call her? I clicked the email with trembling fingers. "Elliot, I know it's been a long time, but we need to talk. It's about Aiden. He's very sick. Please call as soon as you can." There was a phone number at the bottom. No love, no miss you. Just a sterile plea for help. 100 emotions surged through me. Anger, hurt, confusion. But the strongest was disbelief. Aiden? Sick? The golden boy who could do no wrong? He was untouchable, or so I'd thought. I closed the laptop with a shaky exhale, pacing the room like a caged animal. Every rational part of me screamed to ignore the message. They hadn't cared about me for over a decade. Why should I care about them now? But some treacherous part of me, a scarred, desperate kid still yearning for family, couldn't let it go. Against my better judgment, I grabbed my phone and dialed the number. The line rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Elliot." Her voice was thinner, more fragile than I remembered, like it might shatter under the weight of its own guilt. "It's me," I said, forcing my voice to stay steady. "Oh, thank God," she breathed. "I didn't think I wasn't sure you'd call." Neither was I. There was a long, awkward silence before she spoke again, her voice cracking. Aiden's in the hospital. He needs a liver transplant. Her words hit me like a freight train. And, I asked coldly, "You're his best match," she whispered. "The doctors. They said siblings have the highest chance." My breath caught. "So now I'm family? It's not like that, isn't it?" I cut her off, years of buried resentment spilling out. "You abandoned me, left me like garbage on Aunt Meredith's porch and never looked back." Her voice wavered. We made mistakes." "Mistakes?" My laugh was bitter. "Is that what you call 12 years of silence? I know we don't deserve anything from you," she pleaded, tears choking her words. "But please, he's dying." I clenched the phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. Every cell in my body told me to hang up, to let them suffer the consequences of their cruelty. But then I remembered Aiden. Not the perfect golden boy, but the kid I used to share late-night secrets with, before everything went wrong. "I'll think about it," I muttered and ended the call. The phone slipped from my fingers as I collapsed onto the couch, head in my hands. I hated them. I hated that they still had this power over me. But more than anything, I hated that I still cared. I didn't sleep that night. Memories clawed at my mind. Aiden's face twisted with laughter as he breezed through life, effortlessly charming everyone while I faded into the background. I told myself I didn't owe them anything. They'd made their choice years ago, and now I was supposed to save the very person they'd abandoned me for? But beneath my anger was something far more dangerous. The faintest trace of hope. What if helping Aiden meant I could finally confront the past? Find closure? The next morning, I called Aunt Meredith. Her familiar, steady voice grounded me like it always did. After I told her about Aiden's condition, she was quiet for a long time. "They used you, Elliot," she said gently. "And now they want to use you again." "I know." My throat tightened. "But if I say no, he dies." There was a long pause. "Whatever you choose, don't do it for them." Her words echoed in my mind as I dialed the hospital. A clipped, efficient voice answered, transferring me to my mother. "Elliot." Her voice was strained, breathless. "I'll get tested," I said, my tone flat. "But this doesn't change anything." She exhaled sharply, like she'd been holding her breath for years. "Thank you. You don't know. I'm not doing this for you," I snapped. "Just tell me where to go." 2 days later, I stood in the freezing hospital parking lot, staring up at the sprawling, lifeless building. Snowflakes drifted lazily through the air, landing on my worn coat as I forced myself through the automatic doors. A nurse led me to the transplant evaluation center, where a doctor with a practiced smile explained the testing process. Blood work, scans, compatibility tests, it all blurred together in a haze of cold efficiency. Hours later, I was leaving when a voice I hadn't heard in over a decade stopped me in my tracks. "Elliot." I turned slowly. My father stood a few feet away, looking smaller. His broad-shouldered, imposing frame had withered with time, leaving behind a hollow version of the man who used to command rooms with a single glare. "Dad." The word tasted foreign on my tongue. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. For once, he seemed utterly lost. Before he could speak, my mother emerged from a nearby hallway, her face lighting up with desperate relief. "Elliot, you came." "I'm getting tested," I said sharply. "That's all." Her smile faltered, but she nodded. "Thank you for giving him a chance." "I'm not doing it for him." They exchanged a glance, as though silently debating whether to push further. Thankfully, a nurse appeared, saving me from the unbearable awkwardness. "Elliot Morgan?" she called. I followed her without a backward glance, feeling their stares burning into my back. The next day, the doctor called with the results. I was a perfect match. "We can schedule the transplant as soon as you're ready," she said gently, like she could sense the storm raging inside me. "I'll do it," I replied numbly, setting the date for the following week. The night before the surgery, I couldn't stay in my sterile hotel room. I walked aimlessly through the quiet city streets, snow crunching beneath my boots, memories swirling like the frosty wind. I found myself outside the hospital, drawn by some invisible thread. The transplant ward windows glowed faintly against the dark sky, a beacon of life, or maybe desperation. Without thinking, I entered the building, bypassing the front desk until I reached the transplant floor. A nurse looked up, surprised. I'm here to see Aiden Morgan, I stammered. She hesitated but eventually nodded, leading me down a quiet corridor. I half expected her to tell me he was asleep or refuse me entry. But she opened the door and left me standing there, heart pounding. Aiden lay in bed, pale and thin, tubes snaking from his arms. He looked impossibly small, a shadow of the untouchable figure I remembered. His eyes were closed, his breathing shallow but steady. For a moment, old resentments melted away, replaced by something far more fragile, grief. I hated what he'd become, but I hated even more that I still cared. I turned to leave, but his eyes fluttered open. Elliot! His voice was hoarse, disbelieving. I froze. Yeah. He blinked, as if trying to convince himself I was real. You came. I'm not here for a reunion. My voice was harsher than I intended. His lips quirked into something that almost resembled a smile. Still sharp-tongued. Guess some things don't change. My stomach twisted. You should rest. His gaze lingered, searching my face like he was memorizing it. I'm sorry, he whispered. The words shattered something inside me. All the anger, bitterness, and loneliness of the past 12 years surged up, threatening to choke me. I don't care, I lied, turning away. But before I could leave, he rasped. I never wanted them to leave you. The raw sincerity in his voice stopped me cold. He sounded broken, human. I clenched my fists, forcing down the surge of emotion. Rest, Aiden. We'll talk. If we make it through this. His breath hitched, but he nodded, eyes fluttering closed again. I slipped out of the room, barely keeping it together until I reached the cold, empty hallway. Maybe I should have felt triumph. After all, I was finally the one in control. But all I felt was grief. The morning of the surgery came too soon. Nurses prepped me, their gloved hands cold and efficient. The blinding white hospital lights buzzed overhead as I lay on the gurney, heart pounding. There was no turning back now. Ready? A nurse asked, her tone gentle but detached. I nodded, though my entire body screamed otherwise. My chest felt tight. Not from fear of the procedure, but from the crushing weight of unresolved memories, guilt, and anger. As the anesthesiologist leaned over me, I whispered a silent goodbye, not just to my life as I knew it, but to the bitterness I'd carried for so long. Darkness swallowed me whole. Waking up felt like clawing through thick fog. The world swam around me, heavy and disorienting. Pain radiated from my side, a deep, burning ache that pulsed with every shallow breath. I tried to move but couldn't. Everything hurt. A familiar voice broke through the haze. Elliot! I forced my eyes open, blinking against the harsh fluorescent glare. Aunt Meredith's face came into focus, lined with worry but softened by relief. Hey, kid, she whispered, tears glinting in her eyes. Did it work? My voice was a rasping croak. She nodded, squeezing my hand. The doctors said the surgery went perfectly. Aiden's stable. A strange, dizzying mix of emotions surged through me. Relief, resentment, and something far more complicated. I'd saved his life. He was alive because of me. Days passed in a haze of medications, nurses, and endless monitoring. Aunt Meredith rarely left my side, her quiet presence grounding me in a way I hadn't realized I needed. I half expected my parents to appear, full of awkward gratitude or empty apologies. But they didn't. Until the fourth day. The door creaked open, and I instinctively braced myself. My father stood in the doorway, rigid and uncomfortable, followed closely by my mother, her eyes red-rimmed and hollow. They looked like strangers wearing familiar faces. Elliot, Mom whispered, voice trembling. I stared at them, expression cold. You got what you wanted. He's alive. Dad's jaw tightened, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Not out of anger, but something much closer to shame. "We're not here because of that," he said quietly. Mom stepped forward, desperation etched into every line of her face. We wanted to say thank you." Her voice cracked, and for a fleeting moment, I saw something raw and real beneath her practiced mask. I clenched my teeth. "You abandoned me. We know." Her voice broke entirely. "And we'll regret it for the rest of our lives." Dad nodded, his gaze heavy with guilt. "We were wrong, in ways we can't fix. But you need to know, we never stopped thinking about you." I laughed bitterly. "Thinking? You think that counts after 12 years of silence?" His shoulders sagged. "No, but it's all we have left." The room fell into a suffocating silence, thick with unsaid words. For a brief, dizzying moment, I wanted to believe them, to let their guilt and regret undo the damage they'd caused. But wounds like mine didn't heal with words. "You should go." My voice trembled despite my best efforts to sound indifferent. Mom hesitated, then nodded, tears streaming down her face. Dad gently guided her out, pausing at the door to meet my eyes one last time. There was no anger, only sorrow. As the door closed behind them, I exhaled a shaky breath, chest tight with something dangerously close to longing. I thought that was the end of it. I expected Aiden to stay silent, wrapped in his own survival, too consumed by recovery to think about me. But 2 days later, he appeared in my doorway, pale and unsteady but very much alive. "Can I come in?" he asked softly, leaning on a cane. I shrugged, too tired to argue. He limped over to the chair by my bed and sat carefully, wincing as he settled in. For a moment, we just stared at each other, the past stretching between us like an unbridgeable chasm. "I heard you were doing okay," I said, breaking the silence. His lips quirked into a weak smile. "I could say the same about you." Silence fell again, heavy and uncomfortable. He fidgeted, fingers trembling slightly. "I meant what I said before the surgery," he whispered. "I never wanted them to leave you." My throat tightened. "You still let it happen." His face crumpled with guilt. "I was 10, Elliot. They didn't listen to me." I looked away, jaw clenched. I hated how much I wanted to believe him. "I know I can't change what happened," he continued, voice thick with emotion. "But I'm still here, if you'll let me be." The sincerity in his voice knocked the air from my lungs. I'd spent years building walls of anger and hurt, convinced that forgiveness was impossible. But sitting there, stripped of everything, I realized something painfully simple. I didn't want to be alone anymore. "I don't know if I can forgive you," I admitted, voice raw. Aiden nodded slowly. "I'm not asking you to. But I'm not giving up either." We sat in silence, not quite healed but no longer broken beyond repair. For the first time, the future didn't seem like an impossible distance. Maybe we couldn't rewrite the past, but we could try to build something new, together. Thanks for tuning in. Can broken bonds ever be mended? Like the video and explore more dramatic tales on our channel.